Hi all, Dr. Clark here again for forest management. This week, we're going to talk about the role of government in forestry or forest management. Okay? And there's been a lot of, controversy around government owned lands, whether it's good for the land, whether it's bad for the land, what's the purpose of, the actions on the land? Are they allowing clear cut logging? All kinds of things that have been put forth. One of the things is a lot of comics like to depict, government entities in a funny way, I guess you could say. And this one, was a few years in the past. The U.S. Forest Service came up with a roadless rules, okay? And I shouldn't say a few years. It was under Clinton's presidency, so it's been quite a while. But the roadless rules came into effect, that the Forest Service was going to limit how many roads were allowed to be made across Forest Service land. It was going to shut down a lot of these old dirt roads that were there maybe for the purpose of logging, but had really no functionality any longer. And so this was kind of the big push. And, a lot of, comics had a good laugh or a good play on this with, well, you've already destroyed the landscape by allowing clear cutting and things like that. Who really cares about your new policy of no roads or roadless regions? Okay, and I guess we'll approach this from just kind of a facts point of view. I'm not going to get into the politics behind it. As we discussed before, forest management is very political. Okay, you have an economic portion of it, you have an ecology portion of it, and you have a sociology portion of it. Well, clearly, the economic and sociology portions can be very political. The scientific ecology portions should not be political. Sometimes they are, but they should not be political, and that's how scientists are trained, is to not have an agenda, to just collect data and present the data as it is. And good scientists do that, although, like any entity, any industry, any human, you can have some individuals that can be bought out potentially, by corporations to fudge the numbers or tweak the numbers, to side with one section or one entity versus another. Okay, but we're not really going to get into that. It's very rare that scientists don't agree on a finding. If 99%, 95% of scientists agree on a finding, that's okay with the scientific community. That you have 5% error. That's how we run our experiments anyways. If you have 5% of the time that your experiment doesn't work, 95% it does, then you're confident that what you've found out is a true fact or a true finding. Same thing would go for the scientific opinion. If 90% of all the scientists research show one thing and 5% show another thing, most often the scientific community will just lean on the 95%. And that's how, that's how mathematics, statistics, and science work. So with that being said, we're going to jump into some things, some roles that the government play. And you as an individual, if you have your science hat on, you should be approaching these rules and approaching these acts and what's in place, laws, from a scientific point of view. You can later, if you're not in the role as a scientist, you can approach it from a political view or a sociology view or however you want. But in this course, we're going to kind of try to present everything as a fact, and you're going to try to go forward with what, what's the good and the bad from a scientific point of view. Okay, with that being said, first we got to start with some of the roles that the government had in deforestation. Okay, the first one would be the Homestead Act of 1862. Right? The Homestead Act of 1862 is one of the main reasons why the eastern part of the United States is basically 100% new growth. Okay, so there's really, I think there's actually less than 1% old growth forests in the eastern part of the United States, and part of that reason really comes with the Homestead Act, and even into the central part of the United States and parts of the West, the Homestead Act was really important in that individuals could claim 160 acres. And as long as that 160 acres, as long as you took and you cleared the trees off of it and made it farmland, then it was yours. Okay, so that's the improvement that you had to make as part of the Homestead Act, is you had to clear the trees, make it farmland, and the 160 acres was yours. Well, later came the Timber Culture Act. It really only took about 10 years, and we realized, whoa, you give people free land and you tell them, hey, it's yours if you clear all the trees and make it farmland, they're going to do it, and they're going to do it fast. And by 1873, we realized we're losing all our forests. Okay, so that really came into play, that the Homestead Act kind of, I don't want to say it evolved, but it kind of merged into the Timber Culture Act, which meant that you can get 160 acres, but you must have 40 acres of trees. Okay, so now we realize, whoa, wow, we lost all our trees, we lost all our forests, and we started to see the impact of not having any trees. You have no windbreaks, a lot of the topsoil was being blown off. Okay, you have no filtration. There was a lot of landslides, and the hills were bare. So we had some major issues with just clearing all the trees and making farmland. So the Timber Culture Act came in, and that means that you must maintain 40 acres of trees on your 160 acres. Right. The other thing that was happening in those late 1800s is timber companies were starting to migrate and move into the national forest. Okay? And this was, sometimes it was not permitted. Sometimes it was done under kind of the blind eye of a forest manager who just, they didn't really care, or they were paid a little bit under the table for these timber companies to come in and start cutting. Sometimes there was no forest manager. The government owned that land, but no one managed it because in the 1800s, there wasn't very many Forest Service employees. There wasn't very many Forest Service managers. So we had a lot of forests, especially in the western part of the United States, that were part of government property, but no one was there. No one was there to police it, to manage it, etc. So a lot of timber companies would just go onto those lands, and they would openly clear cut the land and steal the timber off of it. Okay, so that kind of brings me to the role of government more modern times. So that was the role of government when it came to establishing the United States, establishing the western part of the United States for sure. Now, we should talk about what's the role of government kind of today or more modern times after, the United States was established and the majority of states were, well, states. Okay? So, first of all, at least from the Forest Service point of view, they have both the John Muir side, which is preservation, and the Aldo Leopold, or the Pinchot method of conservation. And I don't want to say that it's Pinchot method of conservation, because the method of conservation has evolved because of Aldo Leopold. So if it was just about utilizing resources, etc., then it would be kind of Pinchot's method. But because Aldo Leopold pointed out, hey, we're not just managing for a single species on the landscape, we need to manage for the ecosystem. That's where the conservation kind of component comes in today. So for conservation and U.S. Forest Service, they do allow timber harvests. Okay? They allow individuals to get cutting permits. Sometimes they'll allow, depends on the region, they'll allow for Christmas tree harvest, and then they also allow for corporations to come in, make bids to cut certain swaths of land. And again, this really depends on the Forest Service. It depends on how much land there is there, how much continuous land you have, and what's the purpose. Are you removing it to prevent forest fires? Are you removing it to open it up for maybe grazing? Are you removing it to prevent like beetle, pine bark beetle infestations and things like that? Then timber harvest does occur quite often. Okay, livestock grazing, again, this is done by permit. In majority of national forests, okay, you have to tell them how many head you want on the landscape, and you're going to bid it out. They're going to charge you. Often they charge you a nominal fee for how many head you have. And again, this depends on the state. It depends on the forest, how much, they're charging you and how many head they'll allow you on a certain region of land. Okay? Public recreation, so off-road vehicles. This is a big one today. There's a lot of off-road vehicle use on national forest land. And again, like anything else, like these other resources, where you can do it, it really depends on, the forest itself. So who's managing that forest? Do they have distinct trails? And, you'll get fined if you drive off of them. Is it kind of more open so you can make your own trails? There's a lot of regulations, and it's, dependent on the forest in question. Mining, or, taking of minerals, okay, also occurs on forest land. Okay, and again, depends on the state, depends on the forest. Okay, and then fishing and hunting. Fishing and hunting, at least fishing often gets stuck in both conservation and preservation. So I preface fishing with a CT, which means catch and take, or fishing from preservation, which means catch and release. Okay? There are regions of the Forest Service in certain states that is catch and release only, and then there are regions where you can catch and take. Again, depends on the region, depends on the forest, depends on the managers of that forest. Okay? The other piece of the preservation side is to basically save the resources, not utilize resources, not take resources. So that's open for camping, hiking, boating, fishing. You could add bird watching in here. Whatever, photography, wildlife photography, other things that people would be doing on the landscape, but not taking material off the landscape. It doesn't mean that they're not damaging the landscape. Okay, camping, hiking, boating, fishing, photography, bird watching, you know, dirt, uh, off-road, mountain biking, all those things can actually damage the surface, okay, and can be damaging to the Forest Service, but nothing's being taken off the landscape. Okay, so conservation is limited take, preservation is no take, save the resource. Okay? And the U.S. Forest Service is set up today to try to balance these two, conservation activities and preservation activities. One way to try to balance that is there's a lot of states that have developed forest management zones. Okay, so an FMZ is basically a region where this activity is kind of dedicated. So, especially around things like ORVs, so you might have a region of the Forest Service where they've mapped it out and basically they say, okay, you can utilize ORVs in this region, okay, but outside of this region, they're off limits. Okay? Timber harvest the same way. We're going to timber harvest or we're going to harvest trees in this region. The rest of these regions are off limits. Mining the same way. Okay, hunting and fishing, it's less. Now maybe you have hunting zones, okay, but rarely do you have like a border where you can only hunt this small section. There are some states that do that because they have wildlife like preserve sections next to it, but it's less common than say mining, ORVs, timber harvest. Livestock, same kind of thing as maybe hunting and fishing. It's less common to have a distinct boundary where the livestock can go. Now you can have a distinct amount, and you can have a region. It's typically a much larger region where the livestock can go, mainly because there's rarely are there fences that keep these livestock in a set region. Okay, now sometimes they will put fences up, like a large paddock kind of region, and it depends on the manager, depends on what they're going to be doing in that region. Okay, same thing over on the preservation side, though. There are regions where you can have camping, but you might have a day limit, so it might be a 14-day limit for camping in that region. Hiking, now, from the Forest Service point of view, hiking, they might have distinct trails that are groomed for hiking, but as far as whether or not someone can hike off trail, rarely are you going to find a region where it says no off trail hiking. Boating, there's going to be boating limits. Clearly, the FMZ would be a lake for boating and maybe bodies of water for fishing and boating and things like that. The limits would come around, excuse me, it would come around, what kind of boating can you do? Is it, no motor? Is it a certain horsepower motor? What's the limits on the boating? Fishing, same thing, Is it catch and take? Is it catch and release? Is it catch and release for a certain time of the year? Maybe during spawning time and then catch and take afterwards. These kind of things can also be associated with FMZs. So some of the typical zones that we, would see on an FMZ would be things like recreation zones. The recreation zones will often be associated with ORVs, off-road vehicles. Timber production zones, again, I said that has to do with timber harvest. Historical site zones, I didn't talk about this, but sometimes, the government has purchased property that has old homesteads on it, or maybe they purchased property in which they might have Native American material on it. These would be, part of that historical site zone. And often historical sites are very limited to really anything. Pretty much no camping for the most part on historical sites. Boating doesn't really apply very often, but even fishing and hunting and things like that are often limited around historical sites. Just for the preservation, historical sites are really geared for the preservation of that material that is considered history or historical. And then conservation reserve zones, I talked about this briefly. Sometimes I said that, like livestock might be fenced off from a region, and that could be a reserve zone. Basically, you've allowed livestock grazing in that region before, but now you've fenced it off because maybe you're trying to get that reserve to be reestablished. Timber harvest, maybe you've harvested timber in that region. You want the timber to come back. So you limit the foot traffic, limit the, kind of traffic that comes into that region. Those are conservation reserves. So modern forest management, modern forest service is really around compromise. Okay? Now, when I say compromise, it's compromise, but still, you have to realize that the Forest Service gets its money from the government. So it really depends on the leaders in the government on how that compromise might look. So if you have somebody who is in office that is more of a preservationist, then you might see the compromise get slid into more of a preservationist mode of compromise. So you might get more land set aside for hiking and camping and historical preservation, and less timber harvest and mining and things like that go on the land. And you get the flip flop. If you're, got somebody in office that's more of a conservationist and approaches the land as kind of a commodity, then you might get a lot more timber harvest, mining, things like that, grazing that would occur on the landscape. So compromise, it's kind of a loose term. It really is dependent on the government and who's in office and kind of their mindset on which way they want the land to be managed. Majority of the time, I don't want to say any group is completely happy, and that's why you have a management service, is so that you can file complaints, you can go to the open forums, you can express your opinion about how the land should be used and utilized, etc. And sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. That's just the way it is. Okay. Now, one of the key components to forest management that I think needs to be clear to individuals who are going in to the field of forest management is that you need to have a plan. If you're working for the Forest Service and you're managing a certain forest and there's no plan really in place for the forest, you're in bad shape already. Okay? So even though it's hard to make groups happy, a plan, even if it's a plan that doesn't have a huge amount of support, a plan is better than no plan. No plan gets you in sticky waters. Basically, no plan means first come, first serve, and the forest suffers typically from those kind of attitudes. We've seen the no plan enact. The no plan on the eastern part of the United States has degraded the landscape by a great deal. We've lost about 75% of the topsoil there. And like I said before, it's about 99% replanted. Okay, so the old growth wood that was in the eastern part of the United States, it's all gone. And that's really because the plan, if there was a plan, it was a really poor plan in majority of the regions. But most regions, there was no plan, or the plan was build America, and build America by giving people land and making it farmland. I guess one could say that's a plan, but it's not a well thought out plan if you want to keep wooded land, you want to keep topsoil, things like that. It might be a plan to increase your economy, but it's not a plan that's based on science or ecological information, which is where hopefully forest managers of today are getting their information. They're, consulting science or doing science themselves from an ecological standpoint. They're making decisions. Okay, they're also looking at the economics and the political views and the sociology of the region to make decisions also. So, early on, the plans might have been one, took into one entity, okay, and that was economy. Let's make money. Okay, and the plans today should take into at least, the three components of silviculture, and from there, other components might come in. Maybe, from an ecology point of view, maybe you're basing a lot more on soil type, or maybe you're basing a lot more on geology, or maybe you're basing your decisions a lot more on endangered species, which will come to, the role that the Endangered Species Act has played. So from these plans, or making of no plans to always having a plan, really came forth in 1976 with the National Forest Management Act. And that's really where that make a plan, show the plan, have that plan as a public record so people can see how you're going to manage this landscape. Remember, the land at which forest managers, especially from the U.S. Forest Service, that land belongs to the public. It belongs to citizens of the United States. Yes, it belongs to the government, okay, but you have a right to that land. So you have a right to know how that land is going to be managed, and that's really where the National Forest Management Act came into play. So part of that act was this development of comprehensive plans. Okay, so the Forest Service must develop comprehensive plans for how they're going to manage the government's land. By doing that, they also have to make those plans available to the public because it's public lands. So you do have the capability of asking for the management plan for a given swath of forest, and the U.S. Forest Service has to give you that management plan. Okay, that's just part of the Act of 1976. This is often done. These forest management plans are often done and then presented in, kind of forums or open arena where the public can come and talk about that management plan, whatnot. Now, whether or not different states are good at getting the word out on when that plan is going to be discussed, that's a different ballgame. Okay, that's a different argument. That's a different story. That's a different topic. Not every entity in the government is very good at communicating when things are going to occur. And the Forest Service is one of those entities that, depending on the region, unless you know somebody in the Forest Service and have ties to it, or you know exactly where to look, you'll never hear about when these management plans are being presented to the public. And that's one of the main complaints that you'll often hear from the public around these, government-owned lands is they'll often say, well, we didn't get asked. We didn't see those management plans. We didn't know that you were going to allow for the harvesting of trees, above these on the Forest Service land, but above these privately owned properties. We didn't know that was going to occur. And, in many cases, it was given, the public forum was given, but they only have to announce it. In many states, they only have to announce it a few days ahead of time. Okay, that's the requirement. And they might have to just stick it in one newspaper. So it depends on the state, depends what those regulations are, and you may or may not see them. But at any rate, it's given. Okay, that information is given, and if you're interested in a certain forest because you live next to it, you can always just go to your local Forest Service branch and say, hey, I want the management plan for this forest. I want to know what you guys are going to do in this forest, and what part is set aside for conservation, what part is set aside for preservation, and then on that conservation side, how much of this is going to be cut, how much is this going to manage for ORVs and things like that. Okay, so again, that information has to be supplied to the public if the public wants it. Okay? All right, so one of the things that kind of brings me to is that's really the role of the Forest Service today, kind of manage both conservation and preservation side, inform the public, make plans, etc. But how did that come about? Well, part of the reason that came about is certain acts that were developed. So in the 1960s, a lot of acts were developed geared towards management and preservation of resources. So conservation, but also preservation of resources. We saw, after World War II, we saw this huge explosion in the Industrial Revolution, and we started cutting a lot of trees, and we started converting a lot of landscape into more barren land. And so you start to see these acts that were put forth in the 60s after we start realizing, roughly 10 years later, we start realizing, wow, the landscape is looking pretty harsh again. The air is terrible, the water is dirty, and we started thinking about what we're doing to the landscape. Okay, so put forth Multiple Use Sustainable Yield Act. Basically, what this said is that the forest resources, especially those owned by the government, now, BLM owns pieces, U.S. Forest Service owns pieces, U.S. Fish and Wildlife might own pieces, depends on the state. USGS might own pieces, depends on the state. Okay, but the governmentally owned pieces of land need to be set aside for multiple use. And that would include wildlife, recreation, grazing, timber production in the case of forested regions. Okay? So those are the main four that kind of multiple uses that are set aside. So it was really supposed to prevent the clear cutting of all the land, because if you clear cut all the land, the wildlife resources are gone. Okay? It's also supposed to prevent making the entire land a preservation where you don't cut any of the trees and you just leave it alone just for the wildlife. then you can say that, well, maybe grazing might be hampered by that. Timber production would definitely be hampered by that, etc. So, multiple use, sustainable products. Okay? From that really drove kind of the need. 20 years or so after the Industrial Revolution, we started to see, okay, yeah, the economy's growing, we're doing great. America's, becoming this powerhouse of a country, but in doing so, we're destroying our environment. So the Clean Air Act in 1970 was, developed. Environmental Pesticide Control Act, 1972. That was mainly due to DDT. Okay, the Water Pollution Control Act in 1972, also partly due to DDT, but also had a lot to do with overgrazing, extreme timber, clear cut of timber along streams, industrial sites dumping wastewater into local rivers and things like that. Our waters were very polluted at the time. Many of these acts were stemmed from Rachel Carson's research that went into Silent Springs. So if you've never read Silent Spring, I highly suggest the book. Rachel Carson was a marine biologist, but she was also an avid birder, and noted that there was a huge decline in warblers and other songbirds after kind of the heavy use of DDT. Right? And so that kind of springboard the United States into developing these different control acts and banning DDT. Along with Rachel Carson came a very important player that most people really don't know, and that was an eagle biologist, a bald eagle biologist named James Greer. Okay, Dr. James Greer was a bald eagle biologist, a golden eagle biologist. He was a raptor biologist in general. Okay? And he studied bald eagles, and he studied bald eagle number of pairs of bald eagles. He studied their nesting habitats and things like that. Well, he noted that in 1963, the nation's bird, okay, had 487 breeding pairs. Okay, in the entire United States, we had 487 breeding bald eagles. Okay, pairs of breeding bald eagles. And apart from that, their reproductive output was nearly zero. Okay? So James Greer, along with evidence that came out of Rachel Carson and a bunch of other scientists, they started putting two and two together, and they started realizing, well, the effects of DDT on the eggshells of these birds that are eating things that are coming out of the water, mainly birds that are eating things that are coming out of water. What was happening is DDT was being sprayed across the fields to kill out insects. Excellent insecticide. Basically kills every insect that it ever comes in contact with. That was being washed off into streams and rivers and lakes. Insects were ingesting the material, and the material was being ingested into the insects. Okay, and then the insects were being consumed by small fish, and then small fish were being consumed by bigger fish. And what you were getting is, yes, maybe the aquatic insects, because you get this dilution variable where the DDT is being diluted by the water, maybe those small insects were not dying necessarily from ingesting, small aquatic insects from ingesting the DDT. But once that small insect was consumed by a fish, and that fish is going to eat a bunch of small insects, that small fish was accumulating DDT. in its system. And then a bigger fish is going to eat a bunch of small fish which have DDT, and that's going to accumulate DDT, more DDT in that bigger fish's system. This is called bioaccumulation. Now, the main problem with this is the top of the bioaccumulation pyramid was our nation's bird, okay, and other birds, okay, egrets, blue herons, pelicans, lots of other aquatic fish-eating birds, were really suffering. Bald eagles, though, this was key because the bald eagle is the nation's bird, and really, what nation wants to have to declare to all other nations, oh, we had to switch our nation's bird because we made it go extinct? I mean, that would just be laughable to most other nations, really. So we had to do something about it, and I would argue that if it wasn't the nation's bird, we probably would have waited a lot longer, because of the politics and the economics with using DDT. DDT was so great as an insecticide that it increased yields off of crop fields. I mean, in some cases, tenfold. But then, that outcome of DDT causing the bald eagle and the nation's birds' eggshells to be so thin that when the female would sit on the nest, she would crack her own eggshells, and basically reproduction was zero. So Jim Greer, Rachel Carson was, kind of spearheading that. Jim Greer was spearheading it when it came to bald eagles. And DDT eventually got banned, and you start to see the numbers. Okay, it was banned here after in the 70s, and you can start to see the numbers start to climb. Okay, and the bald eagle was really low. It's far more than 10,000 breeding pair now. Okay, but in 2006, basically, when this publication, or another publication by Jim Greer came out showing the status of the bald eagle in present day, it was close to 10,000 breeding pairs. It had recovered enough that it should be removed from the Endangered Species Act, but because it was a nation's symbol, it remained to be a protected organism. Okay? But it just goes to show you that there's a direct tie with government and how the forested habitat, or how acts or roles that the government might play indirectly affect forested habitat. So clean air, clean water, these kind of acts were based on farmlands, but it directly benefited forested habitat, because how do you clean the air? Well, you plant more trees, you stop cutting trees down, you stop burning fossil fuels as much. These kind of things would add to the ability for forests to stay on the landscape. Clean water. Well, how do you clean your water? One of the great ways to clean your water, besides not polluting it to begin with, but is to utilize trees and other vegetation that would occur along streams that can filter out those particles that you don't want in the water system. Okay? And so those things were kind of a direct result. The Endangered Species Act in 1973 was clearly part of that role from Carson and Greer and the other biologists that were basically saying, look, we're losing our nation's bird. That's why the Endangered Species Act was created, was for the bald eagle initially, but there's other organisms that were placed on the Endangered Species Act at that time. But if you're going to lose your nation's bird, you got to do something about it. And so that's where the Endangered Species Act came about. Toxic Substance Control Act, that's when basically DDT was banned. Clean Water Act in 1977. And so you start to see these huge influxes of the government in the role that the government plays in managing lands. Wasn't just, hey, we're going to manage this forest because it's public land. We're also going to manage Clean Water Act, and the water that runs through private owned properties is also going to be part of that Clean Water Act. So this is where government started to dip their fingers into public lands and start to say, hey, look, yeah, you have an endangered species on your privately owned property. It falls under the Endangered Species Act. You cannot shoot that organism. You cannot destroy its habitat, etc. Yeah, we know this is your private owned farm, but you can't use DDT. Yeah, we know that's your private owned water source, that's rolling through your property. You cannot dump oil or toxic material into the water. These things, you start to see this role of government in the 70s start to overlap with private ownership. And the Clean Water Act is probably the one that's getting most note today, although Endangered Species Act is starting to get a little bit of information. The current administration wants to change the Clean Water Act to not include water that might be running through private owner property unless the water is navigable by a certain size boat. Okay, before navigable waterways, it's by definition. So the nice thing about having, or maybe not so nice thing about having navigable waterways means, well, what does it have to be navigable by? A canoe, a kayak, an inner tube, or do you have to be able to, put in a barge? Is that what we're talking about when we're talking about navigable waterways? Are we talking about something, of substantial size, small size, etc.? And how often does it have to be navigable? Is that year round, 365, or can it be part of the season? So there's a lot of intermittent streams that, under previous administrations, that were protected because of not the navigable waterway, but because they fed navigable waterways. So previous administrations said, all right, well, if we're talking about the Mississippi, we're also talking about the tributaries to the Mississippi. And if any of those tributaries are navigable, like the Missouri, we're now talking about the Missouri and all of its tributaries. And if any of those tributaries are navigable, we're talking about maybe the Red River or something like that, where you can take a boat up it or down it. Those waters are protected, and the tributaries to those waters. And so basically, it was a building up for protection. Again, the role of government is often dictated by the individual who's in office. And because of terms like navigability, things like that, they can be, basically the act itself can be manipulated based on one's feeling on whether something is navigable or not. Okay? The other big thing that the Forest Service, and I guess you could say a blemish on the Forest Service's record, is how the spotted owl issue was dealt with. Spotted owl issue is pretty famous issue. You're going to read about it in your reader. And it's a pretty famous issue when it came to the Pacific Northwest, when it came to harvesting old growth trees and how it was dealt with. Timber industry didn't think that because of a single species of bird, they should stop harvesting trees in regions. The environmentalists claimed, well, Mother Nature, should be left alone, and you should be managing this land for the ecology, not for the economics. And the U.S. Forest Service, part of their, I guess, part of their role or part of their stipulation was to set aside a certain amount of land around each nest of a spotted owl. So you had a certain circumference around that, which they set aside. And basically, it was thought by many people, okay, well, the U.S. Forest Service wants to just put the bird in a cage. Um, well, it is what it is. They're trying, again, to balance conservation, preservation, and maybe the management of the spotted owl was done incorrectly. But again, they had a plan that was put forth. Maybe the plan was not accepted by either group, the Mother Nature group, the timber industry. Neither one liked the plan. But again, it was Forest Service's land, it's government land. It was their land to manage how they felt was beneficial to that bird. Okay. All right. So with that, that's kind of the general role of the government, just some of the acts, some of the things that have happened to drive the timber industry into its present day form. We're going to talk about some of the present day complications with the U.S. Forest Service, some of the things that they're dealing with, some of the other management entities that they have to coincide with, like Fish and Wildlife, like BLM. What's their role? Often you'll have Forest Service land, but Fish and Wildlife rules on that Forest Service land, or Forest Service land that abuts BLM land. Well, what's the rules when it comes to grazing across those non-borders? There's no fence often, so what's the rules? And so we'll talk more about that. Next lecture, though, we're going to talk about a little bit about timber technique. So I'm going to give you a little math about how to calculate something called the log rule. And we're going to talk about cutting methods for harvesting of timber. Okay.